Welcome to Myths and Slumber. Tonight, we uncover a dark divine secret. The night Perun, the great Slavic god of thunder, was cast out and hunted by the very gods he once protected. A tale of lightning, betrayal, and ancient vengeance. If ancient myths are your kind of bedtime story, subscribe before you drift off. Now get comfortable, close your eyes, and let the ancient stories carry you to sleep. Close your eyes, if you like. Let your breathing slow. Somewhere beneath the oldest forests in the world, beneath roots that have never known light, there is a memory. A memory older than writing. Older than the first city. A story carried in thunder, in the smell of rain on dry earth, in the sound of an oak tree splitting in a storm. Tonight, we follow that memory home. There is a question the old Slavic storytellers used to ask before a tale began. They would sit beside the fire, in houses made of timber and prayer, and they would look at the faces around them, the children, the grandmothers, the hunters with mud still on their boots, and they would ask, what was the world before the first storm? And then they would answer it themselves. Because that is how the oldest stories work. The question is not really a question. It is a door. And when the storyteller asks it, they are simply inviting you to walk through. So let us walk through. In the beginning, not the beginning of the world exactly, but the beginning of the time when gods walked upon it, there was a great stillness. The Slavic people, who would one day spread across the vast plains of Eastern Europe, across the river valleys and the dark pine forests and the sweeping steppes that seemed to have no edge, they remembered a time before thunder. Before lightning split the sky and the rains came hard and clean and necessary. They called this the time before Rod, the progenitor, the first divine force, the one who was present before all others. Rod hung in the cosmic egg, suspended in darkness, containing within himself the seeds of everything that would ever exist. Every god. Every human. Every grain of wheat and every wolf and every oak tree with its deep, reaching roots. And then Rod breathed. And the egg opened. And the world poured out of him like light through a cracked shell. But the world that poured out was not orderly. It was not a neat arrangement of things. It was wild and wonderful and terrifying in equal measure. The rivers did not yet know where they wanted to go. The mountains were still deciding their heights. The sky was enormous and empty and filled with a kind of potential that had no name yet. Into this pouring, living, half-formed world, the gods began to take their shapes. There were many gods in the Slavic divine world. This is important to understand, because later, much later, in the centuries when Christian missionaries came to the great wooden temples and tore them down, historians would try to simplify what they found there. They would say, here are the important ones. Here is a list. And the list would be short. But the Slavic spiritual world was never a short list. It was an entire living ecology of divine beings, spirits, forces, and presences. There were the great high gods, yes. But there were also the domovoi, the house spirits who lived behind the stove and kept the family warm. There were the ruzalki, the water spirits who danced in rivers and could bless the crops or drown a man depending on their mood. There were the leshai, the forest lords, who could lead a traveler in circles until he lost his mind, or guide him safely home if you knew how to ask properly. The world was full of presents. Every tree, every river, every crossroads had something watching it. something tending it. Something that needed to be acknowledged with a word, a small offering, a respectful nod. This was not a superstition. To the Slavic people who lived close to the earth, who depended on rain and sun and fertile soil in a way that most modern people cannot fully imagine, this was simply accurate observation. The world responded to things. The weather changed. The river flooded. The harvest failed or succeeded. Something was at work. Something had to be understood, appealed to, lived alongside carefully. And chief among the forces that shaped everyday life was thunder. Thunder was not merely noise to the ancient Slavic people. It was language. It was a message from above, from that high place where the gods moved among clouds and looked down at the human world. When thunder rolled across the sky, it meant that the great celestial forces were in motion. Something was happening in the divine realm. Something was being decided, or fought, or resolved. Perun. Say the name slowly, the way the old people said it. Perun, feel how it sits in the mouth like the beginning of a storm. How it starts with a breath and ends with something decisive. Something struck. Perun was the lord of thunder and lightning. He was the wielder of the axe that split the clouds open and let the rain fall. He was the god of war and of strength, of the high places, mountain tops, oak trees, the peaks where lightning was most likely to strike. He was the protector of warriors and princes, the enforcer of divine law, the god whose eye watched over oaths and whose punishment came swiftly to those who broke them. He was, in many ways, the most powerful god in the Slavic pantheon. The highest, the brightest, the most feared and most revered. In Kiev, which would become the great city of the early Slavic civilizations, his idol stood taller than all the others. Wood carved into the shape of a man with silver hair and a golden mustache, holding an axe or a hammer, staring out over the Dnieper River with eyes made of some precious stone that caught the light. The priests of Perun kept a sacred flame burning before his idol at all times. An oak fire. Always oak, because the oak was his tree, the great, deep-rooted oak that stood its ground in storms when every other tree was bowing down. The oak that was struck by lightning more than any other, as though Perun himself could not resist reaching down to touch his own sacred tree. When the fire went out, which rarely happened, and was considered a terrible omen when it did, the priest responsible was put to death. That is how seriously the flame was kept. That is how much was understood to depend on staying in right relationship with this god. But who was Perun, really? Not just as a force of nature. Not just as the explanation for why thunder rumbles and lightning strikes. Who was he as a being, as a character, as a figure in the great story of the divine world? This is where the mythology becomes truly beautiful. Because Perun was not a simple god of power. He was a god with a history. A god with relationships, complicated, deep, sometimes painful relationships. A god who fought not just on behalf of humanity but from personal necessity, personal conviction, and eventually, personal wounds. He was a father. A brother. A husband. A king in the heavenly realm. And he was, as we will discover across this long, unhurried night, a god who was betrayed. Not by his enemies. Not by the forces of darkness that he spent his existence fighting against. But by the ones he loved. By his own family. To understand how that happened, to understand the weight of it, the meaning of it, the way it echoes through the thunder even now, we need to go back further. We need to understand the world that Perun was born into. The family he was part of. The ancient order of things that existed before the betrayal that would shake the heavens. We need to understand the gods. In the High Slavic pantheon, there were several great divine figures who stood above all others. Rod, the progenitor, who was the source of all life and from whom all other beings had emanated, held the position of ultimate origin, but in many Slavic traditions, Rod was less an active figure in the daily affairs of gods and humans and more of an underlying force, a cosmic grandfather who had set things in motion and now watched from the deepest background. More present, more personal, were the gods of the first and second generation. Svarog, whose name means something like the bright or the clear sky, was the god of celestial fire and of the forge. He was the maker, the craftsman of the gods, the one who had shaped the visible heavens and taught humanity the secrets of fire and metalworking. The smiths of the Slavic world prayed to Svarog. The first fire of the morning was lit in his honor. Svarog's children were among the most important gods. Dazbog, the god of the sun and of giving, of bounty and brightness. And Svarazhik, whose name simply meant son of Svarog, the god of sacred flame, the fire in the hearth and in the ritual space, the fire that connected earth and heaven. And there was Mokosh, the great goddess, the moist earth mother, the one who spun fate and held the feminine mysteries. Mokosh was ancient beyond knowing, present in the earth itself, in the moisture of soil, in the turning of seasons, in the lives of women and the thread of human destiny. There was Strybog, the god of winds. There was Korse, associated with the sun, whose exact nature scholars still debate, perhaps a solar deity, perhaps a moon-like presence, perhaps a god borrowed from neighboring cultures and made Slavic through generations of worship. And there was Veles. Veles. Hold that name for a moment. Feel its difference from Perun's name. Where Perun crashes like something struck, Veles moves like something sliding through water. Veles slow, liquid, underworld. Veles was the god of the underworld, of cattle and animals, of the earth's depths, of magic and wealth and the wisdom that comes from the dark places. He was associated with serpents, which in Slavic mythology were not simply animals but cosmic beings, symbols of the deep earth, of underground rivers, of the hidden places beneath the visible world. Veles was often depicted as a great serpent or as a figure part human and part animal, dwelling at the base of the world tree, in the roots that reached down into the realm of the dead. They were, in the deepest sense, opposites. Complementary forces. The two poles of the Slavic cosmic order. And they were, in many traditions, brothers. The relationship between Perun and Veles is one of the most fascinating and complex in all of Slavic mythology. They were not simply enemies. They were not simply rivals. They were two aspects of the same fundamental reality, the sky and the earth, the high and the low, the storm and the deep, who needed each other even as they struggled against each other. And it was from within this family, this tightly wound web of divine relationship, that the great betrayal would come. But we are not there yet. First, we must understand the world as it was. The order that existed. The harmony, however fragile, that preceded the breaking. Let your breathing settle, now. Let the images of those ancient forests, those wooden temples, those sacred fires burning in honor of a silver-haired god with eyes of precious stone, let them fill the space behind your closed eyes. We are just beginning. What does the world look like when God sees it? Not as we see it, divided by roads and fences, measured in distances between cities and towns. The gods, if we are to believe the old stories, see the world as a living structure. A vertical thing. A great tree whose roots go so deep that they touch the very heart of death, and whose branches reach so high that they brush the underside of the stars. The Slavic people called this the world tree. In different traditions and different regions, it took different forms, sometimes an oak, always an oak in stories concerning Perun, sometimes an enormous pine or a cosmic birch whose white bark shone like moonlight. But whatever form it took, the function was the same. The world tree was the spine of reality. Along its length, the three great realms were arranged. In the canopy, in the highest branches that swayed in winds no earthly storm could produce, was Nav, or sometimes called Prav, the divine realm. This was the world of the gods, the world of the heavenly order, where Perun sat upon his thundercloud throne and watched over the turning of celestial things. In the middle, wrapped around the great trunk, sustained by the bark and the heartwood, was Yav, the living world. The world of human beings and animals and growing things. The world of markets and harvests and children being born and old men dying. The world we know. And in the roots, in the dark, wet, intricate tangle that went down and down and down until it reached a place beyond darkness, was Nav, the underworld. The realm of the dead. The realm of Velis. This three-tiered universe was not unique to the Slavic people. Many of the world's ancient traditions organized the cosmos this way. Norse mythology had Yggdrasil, the cosmic ash tree, with its 9 worlds and its 3 roots reaching into different realms. Hindu cosmology had its vertical organization of worlds above and below. Even the Christian afterlife, which would eventually come to reshape Slavic religious life, had its heavens and hells and the earthly middle. But the Slavic version had its own particular character, its own feeling. In the branches of the world tree lived 2 great birds. Some traditions called them Zartitsa, the firebird, that blazing creature of light and danger that would become one of the most enduring figures in all of Slavic folklore, the one that every hero eventually had to catch and could never quite hold. Other traditions spoke of the sun and moon as birds or as riders moving through the branches, Dazbog driving his golden chariot from east to west each day, pulling the sun behind him and then resting in the western branches before the return journey. At the roots of the world tree coiled the great serpent, which in different stories was sometimes called Zmi, sometimes described as Velis himself in his serpentine form. This creature was not evil in the simple sense. It was old. It was the accumulated wisdom of all the dead, which Velis tended and kept in the underground pastures where the souls of cattle and people grazed together in the amber light of the underworld. The serpent at the root. The thunder god in the branches. The human world in the middle, held between them, sustained by both. This was the order. This was the arrangement that had been established when Rod breathed and the egg opened and the world poured out. Each god knew their place. Each realm had its keeper. Each force had its counterpart. And for a time, for that long, mythic time that comes before all stories, before the first trouble, it worked. Perun moved through the high world with his axe and his thunderbolts, maintaining the integrity of the heavenly order. When the storm clouds gathered, it was Perun gathering them, pressing them together until the pressure became too much and lightning cracked out like the blow of a divine weapon. And in that crack, the sky opened, and rain fell. To the farmers of the Slavic plains, this rain was everything. It was the difference between eating and not eating. Between the family surviving the winter or not surviving. Rain was not a metaphor. Rain was the literal gift of Perun's labor, his battle against drought, against the hoarding of waters, against the forces that wanted to keep the sky dry and the earth hard and the people hungry. Because in many Slavic myths, the storms that Perun produced were not just natural phenomena. They were the visible traces of a battle. Perun was always fighting. Always in motion. Always in pursuit of something, or something was in pursuit of him. The great enemy, the force he spent most of his divine energy opposing, was the serpent being associated with Veles, the one who stole the cattle, who stole the rains, who stole sometimes the sun itself, holding it captive in the underground realm and plunging the world into cold and darkness. Perun would ride out. His chariot would fill the sky with the sound of thunder. His axe would flash. And the serpent would flee, downward, always downward, retreating into the earth, into the trees, into the rivers, into any living thing that could serve as hiding place. And Perun would follow, striking at every place the serpent hid, splitting trees with lightning, churning rivers with his weapons, pursuing the thief all the way to the roots of the world tree if necessary. And when the battle was won, the stolen things would be released. The cattle would return to the meadows. The rains would pour from the opened clouds. The sun would climb back into the sky. And the people below, looking up at the storm that was even now passing and revealing blue sky behind it, would breathe with relief and say, "Perun has fought for us again." This is the mythology of the storm as cosmic battle. It is one of the oldest narrative patterns in human religious thought, found in cultures from Mesopotamia to India to the Pacific Islands. The storm god fights the serpent or dragon to release the life-giving waters. It is so old that comparative mythologists believe it may go back to the Proto-Indo-European culture, the common ancestor of most European and many Asian mythological traditions. But in the Slavic version, the story has a particular quality. A particular intimacy. Because Veles was not simply a monster to be defeated. He was family. He was the god that Perun returned to, in some sense, every time he descended from his thundercloud to the base of the world tree. The battle between them was real and repeated, yes. But it was also, somehow, necessary. The serpent had to be chased for the rain to fall. The underworld had to be threatened for the living world to remain alive. They needed each other. Now, let us speak of Perun's nature more carefully. Let us look at who he was not just in battle, but in his ordinary divine existence. Perun was fierce, yes. Powerful, yes. But he was also just. The stories are careful to say this. He was not a god who struck randomly or cruelly. His lightning was not capricious, it did not fall on the innocent. When Perun's lightning struck a person, the old stories said it was because that person had done something to deserve divine attention. When his axe split a tree, it was because that tree was hiding something that needed to be exposed. He was the enforcer of sacred law. Oaths were sworn on Perun's name. Treaties were witnessed by him. When a man swore by Perun in the ancient Slavic world, he was invoking the most serious and binding thing he knew, a promise overseen by the god whose punishment was immediate and inescapable. And he was the protector of his people. In a very personal way. The wooden idols of Perun were not placed high on distant mountaintops, accessible only to priests. They were brought into the center of human communities, into the fortresses of princes, into the gathering places of warriors. He was the god whose strength stood between the people and the forces that would harm them. Warriors before battle would pray to Perun, would make offerings to him, sometimes flowers, sometimes grain, sometimes more solemn sacrifices, the details of which have been largely lost to time, though hints remain in later folklore. They would ask him to walk beside them, to add his thunderbolt to their spear, to make them as unyielding as the oak tree in the storm. And he was the god of the sky's fertility as much as the sky's violence. The same thunder that frightened children brought the rain that grew the wheat. The same lightning that could kill also purified. After a storm, the air smelled clean. The world smelled new. This was Perun's gift, not just power, but renewal. He was, in the fullest sense, the sustainer of the world above. The one who kept the high realm in its proper order and kept reaching down to hold the middle world steady. His wife, in most Slavic traditions, was associated with either Mokosh, the great earth goddess, or with a celestial figure sometimes called Dodola or Perunica, the goddess of rain and flowers, whose name is still preserved in some Balkan languages where certain flowers are called by her name. The iris, that purple-blue flower that blooms after rain, is still called Perunica in some regions, a small living remnant of her ancient presence. The marriage of Perun and his celestial wife was understood as the marriage of sky and earth, the same union that made growth possible, the same partnership that kept the world alive. When rain fell, it was this marriage being consummated again and again. The sky giving its gift to the earth receiving it and giving back the grain and flowers that made life beautiful. This was the divine template for human love. The pattern from which all earthly marriage was understood. And this, too, will matter greatly as our story continues. Because the marriage of Perun and the figure associated with rain and flower and earth would become, in the unfolding of the mythology, one of the central wounds of the divine story. But we are not there yet. Let the images rest for a moment. The great world tree. The three realms. The thunder god moving in his bright domain above. The serpent curled in its dark wisdom below. The human world sustained between them, fragile and beautiful, dependent on the battle that kept the balance. Let it settle like rain soaking into soil. There is one more element of the divine order we must understand before the story truly begins. The divine family was not just Perun and Veles. There were children in this story. There were younger gods, beings of the second and third generation, who had inherited aspects of the great forces from their divine parents. And among these younger beings, born of sky and earth, of thunder and deep water, carrying in their divine bodies the tension between those two great poles, the seeds of the betrayal were already present. Already growing. Already reaching for the light. As all things do when they are ready to be born. Is a child of thunder still thunder? Or is something new made when power passes to the next generation? When the great forces of the world find themselves expressed in younger bodies, newer minds, hearts that do not yet carry the weight of all the ancient battles? The children of the divine world were, in many ways, the most interesting beings in the mythology. Because they were not simply their parents. They were the places where different divine natures met, where sky and earth touched, where thunder and serpent coiled together in a single being, sometimes reconciled into something beautiful, sometimes in permanent internal conflict. Perun had children. The stories are not always consistent. This is the nature of mythology that was passed down orally across centuries and across a vast geographic area. The Slavic people were not a single unified culture with one canonical text, the way the Greeks had Homer or the Norse had the Eddas. They were dozens and eventually hundreds of separate communities, each carrying the mythology in their own version, each emphasizing different elements, each allowing the stories to drift and change with the particular landscape and experience of their region. So we must hold the traditions lightly, gathering them like river water in cupped hands, knowing that some will spill, that what remains is still true to the river even if it is not the whole river. Among the children associated with Perun were figures of lightning and of the solar fire, beings who carried their father's brightness into different domains. There was the understanding that the very sun was connected to the divine family. Dasbog, the sun god, moved through the stories in ways that linked him to Perun's lineage, carrying the fire of the sky forward into each day. But the most significant children for our story were those who fell into the space between realms. Those who inherited not just Perun's thunder but also something of Veles, something of the deep, something of the serpent, something of the capacity for shadow and transformation. Because here is the truth that the old storytellers knew. The betrayal of Perun came from within. And to understand how that could happen, how a god of such power and such justice could be undone not by enemies but by those he loved, we need to understand the nature of family loyalty in the divine world. And how it was tested. Let us speak of Veles more carefully. Because while Perun and Veles were in many traditions described as adversaries, as cosmic opponents locked in their eternal storm battle, they were also, in many traditions, described as beings who had once been close. Who had shared something, origin, perhaps, or an early divine kinship that preceded the great division of realms. In some versions of the mythology, Veles was understood as a god who had chosen the underworld. Not one who had been banished there. He had looked at the divine order as it was being arranged, and he had chosen the deep places, the roots, the darkness, the realm of cattle and the dead and magic, because he saw there a richness and a complexity that the bright heights could not offer. He was drawn to what was hidden. To what the daylight did not reveal. To the knowledge that accumulated in dark places, as gold accumulates in rivers, unseen until someone looks below the surface. In this understanding, Veles was not evil. He was the shadow aspect of the world's divinity, necessary, powerful, and deeply wise. The dead needed to go somewhere. The cattle needed to be tended in the winter months when they retreated to the underworld pastures in the old symbolic imagination. The magic that worked in darkness needed a god to oversee it. Veles was that god. And he held his realm with the same completeness that Perun held the sky. Absolute in his domain. Unchallenged in his depth. He moved like water. And water, as any Slavic farmer knew, goes where it wants. It does not ask permission. It does not respect fences. And Veles wanted things that were Perun's. This is the root of all the trouble. This is the seed beneath all the thunder. Veles looked up from his roots and saw the bright world above and desired it, not in a simple greedy way, but in the way that the deep earth desires the rain. A genuine, profound, irresistible longing for what lived in the upper realm. He wanted the cattle that grazed in the upper meadows, the sacred cattle that Perun watched over, the animals that represented wealth and life and divine favor. In many Slavic traditions, cattle were the primary form of real wealth. A man was rich or poor based on his cattle. The gods too had their celestial herds. The clouds were sometimes described as the cattle of Perun, those great white creatures that he drove across the sky with his lightning whip. Delos would steal them. This was the recurring mythic theft, the serpent god of the underworld reaching upward and taking the sky god's cattle, drawing them down into the deep earth. And Perun would ride out in fury, following the trail of the stolen herd, wielding his axe, calling out with thunder that shook the mountains. But Delos also wanted something more than cattle. Something more personal. Something that cut Perun not as a god of possessions but as a being who loved. Delos wanted Perun's wife. Here is where the mythology becomes most painful. Most human. Most recognizable in that way that ancient stories become recognizable when they touch universal things. The divine feminine associated with Perun, whether she is called Dodola, Perunica, or understood as an aspect of Mokosh herself, was desired by Delos. The god of the deep looked at the woman of the sky and felt that pull that the underworld always feels for the living world. The dark for the light. The root for the flower. And in some versions of the mythology, the ones that are hardest to sit with, the ones that the old storytellers would tell carefully, watching the faces of their listeners, she went to him. Willingly or unwillingly, in different versions. Sometimes abducted, pulled down into the underground realm in the same way that the Greek Persephone was taken by Hades, a cosmic myth pattern so old and so widely distributed that it seems to be woven into the very structure of human spiritual imagination. Spring is the god of the underworld releasing his hold on the earth goddess, and winter is when he draws her back. Sometimes she went with some degree of choice. Drawn to Velos's deep wisdom. His shape-shifting mystery. The things he offered that Perun, for all his thunderous brightness, could not provide. And sometimes, in the versions that speak most directly to the betrayal, it was more complex than either of those things. It was tangled. It was the kind of situation that has no clean explanation, where fault cannot be assigned neatly and pain cannot be resolved with a simple story of good against evil. Because even the gods, the old stories tell us, are capable of grief they cannot fully understand. And the children of Perun, those beings of divine lineage who had inherited their father's brightness along with traces of Velos's depth, they were caught in the middle of all of it. Some of them chose Perun. Some chose Velos. Some spent their entire divine existences trying to serve both and satisfying neither. And some, this is the deepest tragedy, chose against Perun not out of evil intention, not out of hatred or malice, but out of love for something that Perun's order could not accommodate. Out of love for what lived in the dark. This is the shape of the betrayal as it was forming. Not a conspiracy hatched in secret. Not a sudden violent rupture. But a slow accumulation, of desires, of choices, of moments when the pull of one realm was stronger than loyalty to another. Like water finding its way through stone. Like the first crack in the oak tree before the lightning strikes. There is a particular kind of intelligence that does not announce itself. This was the intelligence of Velos. If Perun was the god of what you could see, the bright strike, the visible lightning, the crash of thunder that left no doubt about where the power was and what it intended, then Delos was the god of what you could not see. The god of the slow work. The underground work. The work that happens in root systems and in the hearts of sleeping animals and in the dreams of gods who do not know they are being watched. In the mythology, Delos's relationships were never simple transactional things. He was not the kind of deity who appeared, made his demand, and left. He wove himself into situations over time. He became familiar before he became powerful. He offered gifts, genuine gifts, often, before he asked for anything in return. He was the god of magic in the Slavic tradition. And magic in that tradition was understood as a kind of deep knowledge, not just power, but an understanding of the hidden connections between things. The knowledge of what a plant could do when prepared a certain way. The knowledge of what a word could accomplish when spoken at the right moment, in the right place. The knowledge of how the dead communicated with the living, and how that communication could be used. The folkvi, the Slavic shamanic priests, the ones who moved between worlds, who entered trance states and communicated with spirits, who healed the sick and prophesied and kept the sacred traditions alive, these were the servants of Delos as much as of any other god. Because their work required descent. Their work required going down, into the dark, into the deep, into the place where the hidden knowledge lived. Perun's priests kept the bright fire burning. Delos's servants went underground. Both were necessary. Both were honored. But in the divine family drama that was unfolding, these two modes of spiritual power were pulling in different directions. And the tension between them was finding expression in the relationships among the gods themselves. Delos had spent ages, mythic ages, vast stretches of time beyond human reckoning, studying the divine order from his position in the roots. He had watched how it worked. He had learned its patterns, its rhythms, its vulnerabilities. He understood, for example, that Perun's greatest strength was also, in a certain light, his greatest limitation. Perun was straightforward. Direct. He saw a wrong and he struck at it. He saw a thief and he gave chase. He saw a violation of the sacred law and he enforced it. But the world was not always straightforward. There were situations that directness could not resolve. There were kinds of wrong that could not be struck away with an axe. There were violations that were too intimate, too entangled with love and loyalty and the gray spaces between right and wrong, for a thunder god's simple, powerful justice to address. Delos moved in those spaces. He moved in the space between what someone wanted and what they admitted they wanted. He moved in the space between what was proper and what was longed for. He moved in the dreams that gods had when they were sleeping in their high halls, dreams that Perun, with his direct and honest mind, did not know how to interpret or dismiss. And slowly, over that vast mythic time before the betrayal crystallized, Delos began to make connections. To speak to beings in Perun's family who had, within them, that trace of depth, that longing for something the high bright world did not offer. Let us speak now of a figure that appears in different forms across different Slavic traditions, but whose essence remains consistent, the son or associate of Delos who operated within the divine family, who was raised or loved in Perun's world while belonging in his heart to Delos's. In some traditions, this figure is simply Delos himself in a younger or disguised form, a shape he took to enter the upper world, to walk among the gods in the bright realm while his true nature remained hidden in his roots. This was the shapeshifter's greatest gift, not just changing his appearance, but changing his apparent nature so completely that those who knew him best were fooled. In other traditions, this figure is understood as a being who genuinely loved both sides of the divine world. A child of both storm and depth, who wanted the balance of the whole but found that the divine order would not allow for such balance. The realms had to stay separate. The sky could not mingle with the underworld in a being that walked free in both. And so this figure, wanting everything, was forced eventually to choose, and chose Veles. This is a profoundly human shape for a divine story to take. It is the story of the person who grew up in one tradition but found their truth in another. The one who loves their family but cannot be what the family needs them to be. The one whose very existence is a contradiction that the world's categories cannot contain. And it is the shape that, in Slavic mythology, drives the great divine tragedy. Veles worked patiently, persistently. The way the river works on stone, not by attacking it, but by being consistently present, by being the thing the stone must accommodate, until one day the stone is no longer the same shape it was and you realize it has been changed without any single violent moment of change. He spoke to the one who could be spoken to. He offered what was missing in the bright upper world. He was not cruel in his method, this is important. He did not threaten or command. He waited, and he listened, and he understood what each being needed, and he offered it. This is part of why the betrayal, when it came, was so devastating to Perun. It was not the work of an obvious enemy. It was the work of someone who had been genuinely beloved. Someone who had given real gifts, inspired real love, who was not a monster in disguise but a complex being whose love for Veles's world was genuine, even as it cost Perun everything. The oldest betrayals are never simple. They are woven of true things, true love, true need, true belonging, that simply belong somewhere other than where you need them to. And all the while, Perun moved in his bright domain, fighting his storm battles, keeping the order, enforcing the sacred law. He was not unaware that something was wrong. Gods of his nature feel shifts in the cosmic order, the way a skilled warrior feels a change in the wind before the arrow is released. He noticed things. He asked questions. But the questions were the wrong questions. Perun was looking for enemies, because enemies were what he knew how to find. He was looking for the serpent in the open field, for the thief running with the cattle. He did not know yet how to look for the betrayal that wore a beloved face. He did not know yet that the storm coming toward him was not coming from outside. It was rising from within his own house. What is stolen first is never what matters most. This is wisdom that comes with age, the understanding that the first injury, the first loss, the first violation is rarely the deepest one. It is the opening move. It is the test. It is the universe or the adversary measuring your response, learning your reflexes, understanding how far your lightning actually reaches. The theft of the sacred cattle was the great recurring mythic event in the story of Perun and Veles. The scholars who have studied Proto-Indo-European mythology identify it as one of the oldest narratives in the entire tradition, a story so ancient that versions of it appear in Indian mythology, in Greek mythology, in Norse mythology, in Celtic and Roman and Baltic traditions. The cattle-stealing god, the pursuing storm god, the battle at the crossroads between sky and depth. But let us not think of this as a repeated abstract pattern. Let us think of it as a thing that happened. The sacred cattle of the upper world grazed in the celestial meadows. White cattle, some traditions say, or golden. Animals of impossible beauty, whose milk sustained the gods and whose existence was the divine version of the earthly abundance that every Slavic farmer prayed for. When the celestial cattle were fat and content, the cattle of the earthly world were fat and content. When they sickened or were lost, the earthly herds reflected it. They were tended by beings of the divine household. Watched over. Counted. Blessed each morning when the sky brightened and Dazbog began his solar journey overhead. And then one night, a night when the moon was hidden, when even the stars seemed dimmer than usual, when the divine watchfulness was at its lowest, they were gone. Not all of them. That would have been immediately catastrophic, immediately obvious. No, the theft was subtle. In the best versions of this myth, the cattle simply began to drift. One by one. Moving toward the edges of the celestial meadows, following some invisible path, drawn by some call that the divine herders could not hear. And by the time the absence was noticed, the herd was significantly diminished. The path led down. Always down. Through the clouds, through the middle air, through the high mountains, into the earth, following the roots of the world tree toward the realm of Veles. When Perun discovered it, the response was immediate. Something that felt, if you listened carefully, like disbelief. He took his axe, the great divine weapon, the one that returned to his hand after it struck, the one that split clouds and shattered stone and had never met a force it could not overcome, and he mounted his chariot and he drove it down the sky in pursuit. The lightning he threw ahead of him was meant to flush out the hiding place. Veles, as always, fled. Changed his shape. Became a serpent and slid into the earth. Became a river fish and swam against the current. Became a tree and stood still among its fellows, hoping Perun's eye would slide past. And Perun struck at every hiding place. The old stories explain the landscape in these terms: why certain trees are split, why certain boulders are cloven, why certain river bends exist. Perun's axe touched all of them, searching. Following the trail of the stolen cattle. But here is what the stories also tell us: each time Perun found where Veles was hiding and struck, Veles had already moved. By the time the lightning landed, the serpent was elsewhere. By the time the axe fell, the tree was empty. And the cattle, where were the cattle? Deeper. Always deeper. Already in the underground meadows, already tended by the spirits of the dead in Veles's realm, already behind a door that Perun's axe could crack but not open. Because Perun could not go below. The divine order had established his realm above and Veles's realm below, and a god who crossed entirely into the other's realm, who descended fully into the underworld or ascended fully into the storm heaven, was outside the law. Was no longer operating under the protection of the order he served. This was Veles's cleverest understanding. He could not keep Perun out of the sky. He could not challenge him in the open air, where the thunder god's power was absolute. But he could bring things down into the place where Perun could not fully follow. He could make his thefts irreversible by transferring them to the only place where his adversary's lightning could not reach. Eventually, after the great storm, after the mountains were struck and the rivers churned, a negotiation would occur. Not between Perun and Veles directly, perhaps, because their negotiations were violent ones, conducted through lightning and retreat. But through intermediaries. through the cosmic processes that made exchange between realms possible. The cattle would be returned. The clouds would be opened. The rain would fall. But something subtle had changed. Some small shift had occurred in the divine balance that was not immediately visible. Some understanding had been demonstrated, about what could be taken, about how deeply into the household the reach of Veles could extend, about the places where Perun's power was not absolute. And the next theft would go a little further. As these things always do. The theft of the cattle was the beginning of the education. Veles was learning Perun's responses. Learning his timing, his fury, the precise arc of his pursuit. And Perun was learning frustration, which is something that a god of direct power learns badly, because frustration is the enemy of directness. Frustration makes you strike at the wrong things. Makes you exhaust yourself on diversions while the real loss deepens. And in Perun's divine household, in the relationships that surrounded him, the seeds planted by Veles were quietly taking root. And had begun to carry things back to Veles. Small things at first. Information. The patterns of Perun's watchfulness. The rhythms of the divine household. The moments when the thunder god's attention was elsewhere. Cattle can be returned. Trust cannot. What does a home feel like when it is splitting? This is the kind of splitting that was happening in the divine household of Perun. Let us speak of the specific dynamics that the mythology, gathered from fragments and folk memory and the careful work of scholars who have dedicated their lives to reconstructing what was lost, preserves for us. The divine family in Slavic mythology was not arranged in a simple hierarchy. It was not a single, unified household with one patriarchal figure at its head and all others ranked below in clear descending order. It was more like an extended family gathered in a large compound, different buildings, different relationships, different levels of intimacy and distance, different loyalties and histories. Perun held the highest position in the sky realm, yes. But his authority was not unchallenged. Not because other gods were openly defiant, but because divine authority in the Slavic tradition was understood as something that had to be continually maintained, continually renewed through right action, right relationship, right keeping of the cosmic order. It was not a static possession. It was a living thing. And living things can be damaged. The first person in the divine household to begin drifting toward Veles was, in many mythological interpretations, not a hostile traitor but someone caught between two genuine loves. Someone who had been raised in the brightness of Perun's high realm but who carried within them a darkness, not an evil darkness, but the darkness of depth, of root, of the underground knowing, that could not be extinguished no matter how bright the celestial fires burned. Imagine this figure moving through the divine household. Performing the expected functions, the rituals, the watchfulness, the duties that belonging to Perun's realm required. But at night, or in those deep between times when the divine world grows quieter and the boundaries between realms are more permeable, slipping away. Following the path down through the clouds, down through the middle air, down through the roots of the world tree to where Veles waited. What did Veles offer there? What was so compelling that a being born of thunder would betray the thunder god? Answers, perhaps. The deep, underground traditions say that Veles was the keeper of wisdom, not the wisdom of order and law and celestial mechanics that Perun embodied, but the wisdom of transformation, of change, of the way that everything living must eventually descend into death before it can rise again. The agricultural wisdom that farmers lived by. The seed must be buried before it can become wheat. The cow must die before the sacrifice can feed the community. The leaf must fall and rot before it becomes the soil that grows next year's forest. This was not wisdom that Perun could teach. He could give strength, protection, righteous power. But the deep cyclical wisdom of life through death, that was Velus's domain, and he shared it generously with those who came to him. And perhaps there was also simply love. The stories do not always distinguish clearly between Velus as a seducer, as a teacher, as a relative, as a friend. He was all of these things in different versions. The relationship that drew Perun's household toward him was complex and genuine. It was not simple corruption. It was the meeting of two different kinds of divine truth, and the recognition, painful and irresistible, that the underground truth was also truth. As this drifting continued, Perun began to notice the signs. Not the truth of them, not yet. But the symptoms. The household had a different feeling in the morning. When Perun returned from his storm battles, tired from the pursuit of the serpent across the sky, the faces that greeted him were not quite the same faces they had been. Something was held back. Some warmth was missing, or was present in a strained, effortful way that felt worse than its absence would have. He asked questions. And the questions were answered, but with the care of people who are telling the truth about everything except the one thing that matters. This is a particular kind of lying that is harder to detect than direct untruth because it is mostly composed of real facts, accurate details, genuine expressions. The lie is in what is withheld, in the shape of the silence around the words. Perun, whose nature was directness, did not have the tools to hear that kind of silence. He heard the words. The words were reassuring. He accepted them. And went back to his battles. But the divine world has its own ways of knowing. There are forces in the Slavic cosmos, the fate spinners, the Rosanitsi, the divine women who spun the threads of destiny, who see not just what is but what will be. And in the great tapestry they were weaving, the threads of Perun's household were already showing the pattern that was coming. It was there in the colors. A storm thread and an underworld thread, which should have run separately through the fabric, were beginning to twist together. Not yet visibly, not yet in a way that anyone looking at the surface would notice. But in the warp and weft of destiny, already intertwined. The Rosanitsi wove and did not intervene. This is the nature of fate in Slavic tradition. It is not a thing to be prevented. It is a thing to be completed. The thread goes where it goes. The pattern reveals itself in the weaving. And the pattern was a storm coming. Coming from inside. Among the specific elements that the mythology preserves, one stands out as particularly significant in understanding the division within the divine household. It concerns the sacred knowledge of divine weapons, specifically, the secrets of Perun's greatest tools of power. A god's weapons are not simply instruments. They are extensions of the god's nature. They carry within them something of the divine essence, charged with it, shaped by it, dependent on the god's own vitality for their function. To know the secrets of a divine weapon is to know something intimate and essential about the god who carries it. Perun's axe, sometimes described as the divine thunderbolt itself, the lightning in its most concentrated form, was such a weapon. It was not simply sharp or powerful. It was sacred. It was the instrument through which the divine law of the high realm was enforced, through which Perun's will became visible action in the world. The secrets of its making, of its care, of the particular ways it could and could not be used, these were known only within the divine household. Only to those who served Perun directly, who participated in the celestial order at its most intimate level. And this knowledge was passed to Veles. Not all of it. Not the deepest secret, which was the axe's connection to Perun's own life force. But enough. Enough for Veles to understand better than he had before where the limits of the weapon were. Enough to understand in what circumstances Perun's lightning could not strike, would not strike, could be anticipated and avoided. This was the most concrete of the betrayals. The information that made the subsequent events possible. When Perun eventually learned, and he did learn, though later than he should have, in the way that a trusting person always learns things later than a suspicious person, because trust is a choice to believe the best of those you love, when Perun learned what had been given away, the grief was as large as the anger. Because it was not an enemy who had taken the secret. The enemy could not have taken it. The divine household's defenses were real, its walls genuine, its protection of sacred knowledge genuine. No external force could have extracted that information by force. It was given from inside. By someone who had sat at the same fires, eaten the same celestial meals, sung the same morning songs to the rising sun. Someone Perun had trusted completely. And the thunder that came when that knowledge settled fully into Perun's divine consciousness, the rumble and crack of a god realizing the full weight of what had happened, was said to be the longest, lowest, most desolate thunder the divine world had ever heard. Not rage. Not yet. First, grief. There is a myth older than writing about a god who loses the one he loves to the underworld. You find it in Mesopotamia, where Inanna descends through 7 gates to reclaim what was taken from her and the earth withers in her absence. You find it in Greece, where Persephone is drawn down into the dark by Hades and the world above mourns until her partial return. You find it in Egypt, where Osiris is slain and Isis wanders the world gathering his scattered pieces. The myth of the living world descending into darkness and the cost of that descent, the winter, the hunger, the grief of the ones left above, is perhaps the most universally told story in human religious history. In the Slavic tradition, this myth finds its expression in the figure of Dodola, or Perunica, the rain goddess, the flower goddess, the celestial companion of Perun who carried within her the living green of the world above and the moist generative power that made crops grow. She was beloved. This comes through clearly even in the fragmentary evidence that survives. When later folklorists collected the rainmaking rituals of Slavic villages, ritual processions where young women, crowned with flowers and drenched with water by their neighbors, walked singing through the village to call the rains, those rituals were understood to be enactments of Dodola. Her name was sung. Her nature was called down. The flower-crowned girl became Dodola for the duration of the ritual, embodying the goddess who could open the sky. She was the one who could reach Perun. She was the softer face of the storm, the place where his power became generative rather than destructive, where the thunder became rain rather than wildfire, where the divine masculine force of the sky met the earth and created life. She was, in the most essential sense, the reason the world was alive. Veles wanted her. The mythology is clear on this across multiple traditions and regions. The god of the underworld reached upward toward the rain goddess with the same longing with which the root of the world tree reached downward, the fundamental longing of the deep for the growing world, for the wet and living and green things that it had never been given. The danger of a god who always assumes his love is understood is that those he loves sometimes need to be told. In other versions, it was abduction, Dodola taken unwillingly, carried downward in the same way the cattle were carried downward, through the passage that Veles kept between the upper and lower worlds. Swept into the roots before she could call out, before anyone above could respond. And another version still, the most complicated, most painfully realistic versions, she went partway willingly. Not because she did not love Perun. Not because the upper world was not her home and her nature. But because something in her was drawn to the depth, to the mystery, to the underground knowing that Veles embodied. The same thing that drew the other members of Perun's household toward him. And because those who had been in contact with Veles had been speaking to her. Softly. Consistently. Painting the underworld as something other than what it was, not as death and darkness but as rest and depth and the kind of quiet that the eternal storm of the sky world could not offer. The betrayal from inside the household had prepared the way. When she was gone, the world above felt it immediately. The rain stopped. Not all at once, the sky held its moisture for a time, as though waiting, as though the clouds themselves were not sure this was real. But then, as the days passed and Dodola did not return, the clouds thinned. The sky became a hard, blank blue that was beautiful to look at and yielded nothing. The rivers dropped. The grass paled. The first frost came early, and it stayed. This is the winter myth encoded in the divine drama. The loss of Dodola, the rain goddess, the flower goddess, the soft generative face of the sky world, is the loss of spring. Every year when the cold comes and the rains stop and the world goes bare and hard, it is Dodola in the underworld. Every year when the flowers push through the thawing ground and the first spring storms crack the sky open and the rains return, it is Dodola coming home. The myth explains the seasons. And the seasons explain the myth. They are the same story, told at two different scales. Perun's grief was enormous and visible. You could hear it in the quality of the storms that came even after her going. The rains that fell in her absence were strange rains, cold rains, rains that brought no blessing with them because the blessing was gone. The goddess had always mediated between Perun's raw power and the needs of the living world. Without her, the storms were all edge, all strike, with none of the gentleness that made them life-giving. He searched the sky. He drove his chariot to the edges of the heavens and looked down from every angle, and the world below was pale and still. And then, when the searching had gone on long enough that the grief had become a kind of anger, when the longing had hardened into the iron resolve that Perun's nature ultimately always came to, he gathered himself, took up his axe, and descended. Toward the roots. Toward the place he could not fully enter. Toward the enemy who had taken everything that mattered. The descent of Perun toward the underworld in pursuit of Dodola is one of the mythological high points of the Slavic tradition. It is the great storm made personal. It is the thunder god not fighting to defend the cosmic order, not enforcing the divine law, but simply fighting to get back the one he loved. He followed the path of the world tree downward. His lightning struck at the roots, sending shockwaves through the stone and soil that the human world felt as earthquakes, those strange tremors that occasionally moved through the earth for no visible reason, which the old stories explained as Perun's battle with the underworld's defenses. The boundary between the world of the living and the world of the dead resisted him. Not because it was more powerful than he was. In a simple contest of force, nothing was more powerful than Perun's celestial fire. But because the divine laws that governed the realms were laws that Perun himself had sworn to uphold. The boundary existed partly because of his own authority. To cross it fully would be to become something other than what he was. This was Velus's deepest protection. The one thing that even Perun's axe could not cut, the law that Perun himself embodied. There is a particular agony in that. To be held back from saving what you love by the principles you yourself have sworn to defend. To find that the very thing that gives you your power is also the thing that limits it at the most crucial moment. This is the thunder god's tragedy. And it is a tragedy that resonates far beyond the ancient Slavic world. The oak tree has a secret that no other tree shares. When lightning strikes an oak, the tree is often split, sometimes entirely destroyed, sometimes scarred so deeply that it will never be the same. But the oak is also the tree most likely to survive a lightning strike. Of all the trees that stand in the temperate forest, the oak is the one that most often endures the blow. Split and scarred and deeply wounded, but alive. Still rooted. Still bearing its leaves and its acorns in the seasons to come. The old people saw this and understood something about Perun from it. That the hardest blow does not always end the story. The battle at the roots of the world tree, Perun's great assault on the boundary of the underworld in his pursuit of Dodola and in his rage at the betrayal that had enabled her loss, is the mythological moment that defines Perun's character most completely. Because it shows both his power and his limitation. Both his rightness and the place where rightness alone is not enough. He came at the roots with everything he had. Lightning in such concentration that the very earth cracked open along the lines where his power pressed through it. Those cracks, the old stories say, became the deep river gorges, the places where rivers had found their way through solid rock, where the stone looked as though something enormous had forced it apart. Perun's battle had made the landscape. Velus defended the boundary with transformations, becoming stone, becoming water, becoming the very root matter of the world tree itself, so that Perun could not strike at him without striking at the structure that held all the realms together. This was his most sophisticated defense, disguising himself as the thing most necessary, so that destroying him would mean destroying everything. A god of direct power faces an impossible choice when the enemy has made itself indistinguishable from what is sacred. What do you strike at when striking might bring down the structure you are fighting to protect? Perun hesitated. And in his hesitation, Velus shifted again. The battle had a quality that was different from all the storm battles that had come before it. In those battles, the dynamics were established, Velus stealing the cattle, Perun pursuing, the great chase across the sky and into the earth, the eventual resolution. Both sides knew their roles. Both sides knew the boundaries. This battle was different because Perun was fighting with grief as well as anger. And grief, unlike anger, does not know where to stop. Anger exhausts itself. It burns hot and then, if nothing feeds it, it dims. But grief can go on forever. Grief has no natural endpoint. It keeps finding new places to hurt. And this Velus understood, from his deep wisdom of the underworld, the wisdom of the place where grief is the primary currency, where the dead carry their sorrows like stones, where all the unmourned losses gather. So instead of fighting Perun directly, instead of meeting the thunder god's raw celestial power with an opposing force, Belus did what he always did when the direct contest became unfavorable. He spoke. From the deep roots, from behind the boundary that Perun could not cross without unmaking himself, Belus spoke. And what he said was not a taunt. Not a boast. Not the declaration of a conqueror over the defeated. He told Perun the truth. He told Perun that Dodola had heard stories about the underworld before she came. That the stories had been told to her by those she trusted. That the path down had been shown to her from within the household. And then he waited. Because the real weapon, the one that could wound a thunder god more deeply than any serpent's bite, was not information. It was doubt. Was the sudden terrible question that bloomed in Perun's divine consciousness like smoke from a doused fire. If those I trusted most betrayed me, then who else? How far does it go? How much of what I believed was real? The battle at the roots did not end with a clear victory. This is unusual in the mythology of storm gods. These cycles typically conclude with the thunder god's triumph, the cattle returned, the waters released, the serpent driven back into the earth. There is resolution. There is the restoration of order. But this battle ended differently. Because the thing Perun was fighting for, the restoration of Dodola, the return of the rain goddess to the upper world, could not be achieved through pure force. The divine laws he embodied prevented his full descent. And Belus, in his deep wisdom, knew it. There would need to be a negotiation. A transaction. Some exchange between the upper and lower worlds that satisfied the laws governing both realms. And negotiations with Belus are never simple. They are never quick. They are conducted in the patience of underground rivers, in the slow accumulation of a stalagmite, in geological time. Perun, whose nature was storm and immediacy, had never been good at waiting. And so he withdrew. Not in defeat, in the sense that the great God who carries the law of the universe does not entirely withdraw from a battle he has initiated. But he stepped back from the boundary. He returned to the sky. And he held the thunder inside himself while he decided what to do next. The sky above the ancient world was very quiet in those days. A terrible quiet. The kind that comes before the worst storms. When a family splinters, there must eventually come a moment of accounting. But it must come. Because the human heart, and the divine heart, the old stories tell us, is not so different, cannot carry indefinitely the weight of knowing and not speaking. Eventually the stone cracks. Eventually the river finds its way through. Those who had remained loyal, and there were those who had remained loyal, let us say this clearly, because the story of betrayal is not complete without its counterpart, the story of faithfulness. Those who had stayed in the light of the celestial realm watched him return and did not know whether to approach or hold back. They approached. Because loyalty requires approach even when it is difficult. The members of the divine household who had remained faithful now faced their own moment of accounting. They had known something was wrong. They had noticed the drifting, the late absences, the changed quality of certain conversations. Some of them had asked questions and received the careful, partial answers. Some of them had not asked, because not asking was easier, because asking would have meant acknowledging what they were not ready to acknowledge. And so they, too, had participated in the betrayal, not actively, not with full knowledge, but through the ordinary human divine capacity to avoid seeing what we do not want to see. Perun did not punish them for this. He could not. Because he had done the same thing. He had been in the household while the drifting was happening and had not seen it clearly enough, soon enough, to prevent what followed. The leader who has been betrayed from within his own house is always, to some degree, accounting for himself as well as for the others. This is the bitterest part of the accounting. Not all of them were beyond the reach of the divine household. Some had gone part way and returned, pulled back by some remaining thread of loyalty, by the sound of Perun's thunder over the celestial meadows, by some inescapable recognition that the sky was their nature no matter what the underground wisdom offered. They had come back, and the coming back was its own complicated thing, a return from the darkness that left marks on those who underwent it, a return that could never be a complete return because of what had been given away in the going. With these, Perun sat in long deliberation. The mythology does not preserve the exact words, the precise terms, the specific outcomes of these conversations, because these things were never written, they were told and retold around fires, each telling shaped by the community doing the telling, each version emphasizing what that community needed to understand about loyalty and transgression and the possibility of return. What the versions preserve is the feeling of it. The difficulty of love in the face of betrayal. The divine paradox of a God whose function was justice, whose nature was the enforcement of sacred law, whose instrument was the lightning that punished the oathbreaker, sitting quietly with those who had broken his trust and trying to understand rather than simply strike. This is the part of the Perun mythology that is most rarely discussed. Because it does not fit the simple image of the thunder god as pure power, as the axe-wielding enforcer. It requires us to see him as a figure of genuine depth, a god who had been wounded in the deepest place, in the place of love and family, and who was trying to respond to that wound with something more than force. He was trying to respond with wisdom. With the kind of wisdom, perhaps, that he had never needed before. The kind that lives in the deep places. And then there were those who had not returned. Those who had gone all the way down and stayed. Who had chosen the underground world so completely that the divine household above had become, for them, a foreign country. This is the grief that does not resolve. The loss that cannot be addressed by any action available. The love that cannot find its way to the object of love because the object of love has become unreachable. And Perun felt it the way the oak tree feels the winter, all the way through, to the root. The accounting also included the question of Dodola. The rain goddess who was held in the underworld, whose absence had made the sky dry and the earth hard. What was to be done for her? How was she to be returned? Here the mythology offers multiple answers, all of them partial, all of them true in the way that partial things are true, each capturing an aspect of a reality too complex to be fully contained in any single story. In one version, Perun negotiated with Veles. The negotiation was slow and difficult and took place across the boundaries of the realms, conducted through intermediaries, through cosmic processes that had the quality of geological change, imperceptible in any given moment but decisive over time. What Perun gave Veles in exchange for Dodola's partial return, the stories differ on. Some say it was access, an acknowledgement of Veles's equal cosmic authority, a recognition of the underworld god's legitimate power that Perun's high pride had previously withheld. Some say it was a portion of the sacred cattle, a permanent allocation of celestial wealth to the underground realm. Some say it was simply time, that Dodola would spend part of each cycle above and part below, and that this division was the price of the exchange. This last version is the one that lives most vibrantly in the seasonal rituals, in the flower-crowned rain processions of spring, in the way winter was understood as Dodola's underground time and spring as her return. The price of the betrayal was written into the calendar. Every year, the wound of the divine family was reopened and healed in the turning of the seasons. This is how mythology works in its deepest function. It does not explain the wound away. It does not resolve the tragedy into a clean, happy ending. It encodes the wound into the structure of reality so that the wound is perpetually being healed, perpetually reminding the world of what was lost and what was found again. Every spring is Perun winning back what was taken. Every winter is the reminder of the cost. What remains of a god? When the temples are torn down and the sacred fires are extinguished and the missionaries write in their accounts that the people who had worshipped this thunder god were brought at last to the true faith, what remains of Perun? More than anyone expected. This is the remarkable thing about the Slavic mythological tradition, and about Perun in particular. He was not simply erased. He was not forgotten the way a name written in sand is forgotten when the tide comes in. He was transformed, submerged, hidden in plain sight, tucked into the folklore and the folk practice and the seasonal rituals and the names of plants and the sayings of grandmothers, and he is still there, if you know how to look. The historical moment of transition came in the late 10th century, when Vladimir the Great, the ruler of Kievan Rus, converted to Christianity and began the systematic Christianization of his realm. The year 988 is the traditional date given, the year when the idols of the old gods were dragged through the streets of Kiev and thrown into the Dnieper River. The primary idol that was thrown into the river was Perun's. Imagine that moment. Imagine the people who watched it happen, those who stood on the riverbank and saw the great carved wooden figure, the silver-haired god with golden mustache and precious stone eyes, be dragged through the mud and hurled into the Dnieper's current. The figure that their grandparents had prayed to. The one beside whose sacred oak fire they had burned their offerings and spoken their oaths. The chronicles record that men were sent to beat back any attempts to push the idol to shore as it drifted downstream. Some of the people watching wept. Others called out to the idol, urging it toward shore, addressing it as though it could still hear them, as though the god it represented was still present even in the moment of its humiliation. And here is the thing. Here is the thing that the old storytellers would have smiled at, if they had been standing on that bank. The chronicles also record that the idol drifted to a place known as Perun's shore. That it became lodged there. That for years afterward, people came to that place on the riverbank and made offerings, and no amount of official discouragement could entirely stop them. You can throw the idol in the river. You cannot throw the god out of the heart. What happened to Perun in the Christian period is what scholars call interpretatio Christiana, the process by which the old gods were reinterpreted through the new religious framework. Some were absorbed into Christian saints, their feast days, their attributions, their symbolic animals, all carrying forward the old divine associations in a new form. Perun became, in this process, most closely associated with the prophet Elijah, Sviatoi Ilya, Saint Elijah, in the Russian tradition. Elijah, the thunderous prophet who called down fire from heaven, who rode in a chariot of flame, who moved through the sky in his fiery vehicle making the heavens roar. The parallels were unmistakable, and the common people understood them. Saint Elijah's feast day, July 20th, was in the heart of summer, the season of the great thunderstorms on the eastern European plains. It became known as the day when Elijah rode his heavenly chariot across the sky, and the thunder was the sound of his wheels. People still crossed themselves when they heard thunder and whispered the name of Elijah. They maintained the old prohibition, that it was dangerous to be working in the fields or standing beneath a tree during a thunderstorm, because Elijah was passing. They kept the essence of Perun's meaning alive even as they gave it a new name. In the Balkan regions, similar processes occurred. The spring rituals of Dodola and Perunica, the flower-crowned processions that called the rains, persisted for centuries after Christianization, eventually half absorbed into Christian frameworks, half surviving as folk practice, the original mythological context forgotten by most participants but the ritual itself stubbornly continuing. The flower called Perunica still blooms in early summer in those regions. The iris with its purple-blue petals. The rain flower, the thunder flower, still carrying a name that reaches back past writing to a god who stood in the oldest wooden temples of Eastern Europe. But the mythology did not merely survive in disguised form. It also continued to live in the folk tales, the сказки, the fairy stories that Slavic grandmothers told to children by the stove in the long winter evenings, long after Christianity had officially replaced the old religion. Kashii the Deathless. The one who cannot be killed because his death is hidden, in an egg, inside a duck, inside a hare, inside an iron chest, buried under an oak tree on a remote island in the ocean. The one who keeps the hero's love in his underground kingdom and must be reached through a series of trials. You can hear the echo, can't you? The underworld god who holds what the thunder god loves, hidden behind impossible obstacles, requiring a journey and a cost to recover. Delos became Kashii. Perun's struggle became the hero's journey. The divine myth became the fairy tale. It did not die. It changed its clothes. And then there is the firebird. That blazing creature of impossible beauty that appears in so many Slavic folk tales, the golden bird that every czar sends his 3 sons to catch, the bird whose feather causes nothing but trouble when it falls into mortal hands, the bird that must be obtained and never quite can be held. The firebird is understood by mythologists as a remnant of the solar divinity of the old Slavic world, Dazbog in his most vivid form, or the embodied light of the celestial realm. But it carries within it the same quality that Perun's sacred fire carried. It illuminates, it destroys, it cannot be possessed without consequence. The boy who finds the firebird's feather in the forest is told immediately, throw it away. It will bring you nothing but trouble. And he cannot do it. The feather is too beautiful. The light is too compelling. He carries it to the Tsar, and from that moment, everything in the story becomes harder than it was. This is the mythological memory of what the celestial fire costs, the knowledge that the divine brightness is real but that touching it changes you in ways that are not always comfortable, that change the story around you in ways that cannot be predicted. The firebird flies, ultimately, free. It is not caught. It cannot be kept. The stories that end with the hero in possession of the firebird are the ones that feel incomplete, somehow, because the firebird's nature is to be wild and free and blazing, the same quality that Perun's lightning had, the quality of the sky itself, which cannot be owned by anyone. There is also, in the persistence of Perun's mythology, a political dimension worth understanding. Because for the ancient Slavic people, Perun was not merely a religious figure. He was the divine patron of the warrior class, of the princes and their druzina, their fighting companions, their war band. He was the god of those who held power. When Vladimir the Great converted to Christianity, part of what he was doing was making a political decision about which divine order to align his power with. The Byzantine Christian world offered him an imperial model, the Christian emperor as God's representative on earth, supported by an organized church with its own hierarchy and its own law. This was a more structured, more scalable form of divine political authority than the older Slavic model, where the prince was Perun's man and his legitimacy depended on maintaining right relationship with a god whose priests were the folkvi, the wild shamanic figures with their drums and their trances and their animal skins. The conversion was, among other things, a restructuring of how divine authority flowed. And Perun, as the patron of the old warrior prince order, was one of the casualties. His overthrow from the divine throne of Kievan Rus mirrored, in the human realm, the overthrow of the old aristocratic order and its replacement with the Christian Byzantine model. The god who maintained oaths, who enforced sacred law, who was the patron of warriors, his power was replaced by a church that maintained its own oaths, enforced its own law, and blessed warriors in the name of its own saints. The thunder god was deposed by the thunder of history. But the roots went deep. Roots always do. The Baltic peoples, the Lithuanians and Latvians, who held on to their pre-Christian religion far longer than the Slavic populations to their east, preserved in their mythologies a thunder god called Perkunas, whose name is cognate with Perun, whose attributes are nearly identical, and whose myths preserve much of what was lost in the Slavic tradition's more abrupt conversion. Perkunas rides his chariot across the sky. He fights the serpent god Velnias, cognate with Velis, who steals his cattle and descends into the earth to hide from the thunder god's pursuit. He strikes at every hiding place. He keeps the cosmic order. He is the enforcer of sacred oath. Lithuania did not convert to Christianity until 1387, more than 400 years after the conversion of Kievan Rus. That is 4 additional centuries of the living mythology, 4 more centuries of the folkvi equivalent Baltic priests maintaining the sacred oak groves, keeping the sacred fires, performing the rituals that kept Perkunas honored and the cosmic order intact. The chronicles of the Teutonic Knights, who spent the 13th and 14th centuries in violent campaigns against the pagan Baltic tribes, describe the sacred oak groves of Perkunas with a mixture of horror and awe. Great trees, ancient and enormous, in forests that no one was permitted to enter except the priests. Sacred fires that had burned without interruption for decades, perhaps for centuries. Rites that the knights described in the language of their theological framework as devilish but that were clearly, to any objective eye, the remnant practices of a very old and very serious religious tradition. When those groves were burned and those fires extinguished, something irreplaceable was lost. Not just records, not just artifacts, but the living knowledge, held in practice, in prayer, in the bodies of the priests who knew the exact words and the exact gestures and the exact seasonal timing of how to be in right relationship with the thunder god. And yet, in Lithuanian rural areas, the name Perkunas survived in folk practice for centuries after official conversion. Farmers would mutter his name during storms. The old prohibitions were kept: no work in the fields during thunder, no swimming in rivers during lightning. The folk medicine traditions preserved herbs and practices with deep roots in the pre-Christian cult. The mythology survived in fragments, in sayings, in the shapes of stories told to children that had forgotten their original divine context but preserved its emotional truth. And so Perun, thunderstruck, betrayed, changed but not destroyed, endures. He endures in the iris flower that carries the name of his rain goddess. He endures in Saint Elijah's fiery chariot that explains the summer storms to the grandchildren of people who once prayed to Perun directly. He endures in the fairy tales where the deathless underground sorcerer keeps the hero's beloved and must be undone through the hero's courage and his willingness to descend into impossible places. He endures in the thunder itself, which does not ask permission to speak, which arrives whether or not you have a framework for it. Every mythology contains, at its center, something true. Not true in the literal sense, not true in the way that water is wet or stone is hard, but true in the sense that it maps something real about human experience onto a cosmic stage and says, look, this pattern, this shape, this is something you need to understand about the world you live in. What does the story of Perun, the thunder god betrayed by his own family, say that is true in that deep, lasting, mythological sense? The first truth is about the nature of cosmic order. In the Slavic world image, the order of things was not guaranteed. It was maintained. It required active work, continuous attention, perpetual renewal. Perun did not sit in his high hall and simply be powerful. He rode out. He fought. He pursued. He struck and drove back and pursued again. Order, the mythology says, is not a state that exists once and then persists. It is an achievement that must be continuously re-achieved. The rain does not fall on its own. Someone must fight for it. Someone must be willing to drive their chariot across the storm sky and pursue the forces of hoarding and stagnation all the way to the roots of the world. This was deeply relevant to the agricultural communities who told this story. They lived with the reality that nature could fail at any time. Drought was not a distant theoretical possibility, it was a remembered reality, a communal trauma, the thing your grandmother's grandmother had told stories about. Every summer when the rains came reliably was a gift that had not been guaranteed. Every harvest was a victory over the possibility of its opposite. Perun fighting for the rain was not a metaphor for those people. It was the best available explanation for why the rain came at all. And the betrayal, the forces within his household that weakened his ability to fight, was the best available explanation for why sometimes the rain did not come. Why drought struck. Why the sky went hard and blue and merciless while the wheat withered. The god was struggling. Something had gone wrong in the divine household. And the human community needed to do its part, to offer, to pray, to perform the rituals that added their small human power to the enormous divine effort. The second truth is about the relationship between the high and the deep. Perun and Veles were not simply good and evil. They were two aspects of a single necessary reality, locked in a tension that was not meant to be resolved but maintained. If Perun won completely, if Veles was destroyed, the underworld emptied, the roots of the world tree cleared of serpents, there would be no winter. There would be no death. There would be no completion of the cycle that makes spring meaningful. The world needs both. The world needs the high places and the deep places, the bright strike of the lightning and the dark wisdom of the root. The tragedy of the divine family is not simply that Veles stole and Perun lost. The tragedy is that the tension between them was necessary but could not be maintained without violence, without betrayal, without cost. This is the truth about necessary opposition. About the forces in existence that must remain in tension because their reconciliation would be a different kind of catastrophe than their conflict. About the way that some fights are not meant to be won but meant to be fought, because the fighting is what makes the world continue. For the Slavic agricultural communities, this meant something very specific. The cycle of seasons could not be stopped at the pleasant part. You could not simply have eternal spring, eternal summer, eternal abundance. The death was part of the life. The underworld time was part of the aboveworld time. Veles's winter was not a punishment. It was a necessity. And the annual performance of Perun's battle, the spring storms that cracked the winter sky open and let the warming rains fall, was not merely a celebration of victory. It was a recognition that the battle had to be fought again. Every year. Without end. The third truth, and perhaps the most quietly devastating one, is about the nature of betrayal. The story of Perun contains an understanding that no mythology reaches lightly, that the deepest wounds come not from enemies but from those who love us. This is not the same as saying that family is dangerous, or that love is foolish. It is saying something more precise. That the depth of a wound is proportional to the depth of the relationship in which it occurs. That betrayal is only possible where there was genuine trust. That the storm god's vulnerability, the one thing that Veles exploited, the one thing that no dragon or serpent or external force could touch, was not a weakness in his power. It was a quality of his love. He loved completely. He trusted completely. He gave his household the full measure of his divine fire, his protection, his authority, his sacred weapons' secrets. And the completeness of his giving was what made the wound possible. The mythology does not say he was wrong to love this way. It does not say he should have been more guarded, more suspicious, more protective of his sacred knowledge. It holds the tragedy without resolution, without a lesson that simplifies it into, be more careful next time. Instead it says, this is what love costs. This is the vulnerability that trust creates. And the thunder god, for all his celestial power, was not exempt from this vulnerability. Was not above it. Was made of it, in some essential way, the same way he was made of storm and oak and lightning. The mighty are not mighty because they are beyond hurt. They are mighty, the mythology suggests, because they have been hurt and they have not stopped fighting. The fourth truth is about the persistence of what is sacred. When the missionaries came. When the idols were thrown in the river. When the oak fires were extinguished and the folkvi were driven into the forests or killed or converted. When the official story became, there were never any real gods here, only the error of ignorance, and now the error is corrected. The mythology did not disappear. It went underground. It went where Veles lives. It went into the roots, into the folk practices, the fairy tales, the names of flowers, the sayings about thunder, the ritual processions for rain that the village women kept performing even when they no longer knew quite why. It lived in the calendar of the agricultural year, embedded so deeply that Christian feast days were placed precisely at the old sacred times because the people would observe those times regardless. It lived in the body, in the way people crossed themselves during thunder, the gesture itself carrying the memory of an older gesture that acknowledged the storm god. In the way people blessed bread and salt at the threshold, in the way the hearth fire was treated with respect that went beyond rational fire safety. What is truly sacred cannot be simply abolished. It can be renamed, reinterpreted, pushed below the surface. But it remains in the culture's body memory. It remains in the way children feel when they hear the first spring thunder and something in them responds that has no name in modern language. Perun is that feeling. The feeling that the sky is alive. That the storm is not merely meteorological. That something is moving through it, something vast and old and not entirely indifferent to you. The fifth truth, and the one that brings the whole story into focus, is about the meaning of the oak tree. Why was the oak Perun's sacred tree? Why specifically the oak, which grows slowly and lives long and has roots that go deeper than almost any other tree in the temperate forest, and a canopy that reaches higher than almost any other, and bark that is harder than almost any other, and yet is the tree most likely to be struck by lightning? Because the oak embodies the tension that Perun embodied. It reaches both ways simultaneously, its roots going as deep as its branches go high, its substance simultaneously in Perun's realm and in Velus's realm, its body the living meeting place of sky and earth. It is simultaneously the most celestial of trees, reaching highest, struck by lightning, sacred to the thunder god, and the most deeply earthly, its root system an underground mirror of its canopy, its matter going down into the darkness as far as it goes up into the light. The oak tree is Perun's tree not because it is simply his, but because it is both his and Velus's simultaneously. Because it embodies the very tension the mythology is built around. And when lightning splits the oak, when Perun's own fire cracks his own tree, it is the mythology visibly enacted. The sky god and the earth, in violent meeting. The wound that both destroys and reveals. The split in the bark that lets the air in, that lets the rain into places it could not reach before, that sometimes kills the tree and sometimes creates in the surviving wood a grain of extraordinary beauty, a richness of color and pattern that plain, unscarred wood does not have. The wound, in the oak as in the mythology, is also a kind of opening. An opening to something new. There is a question the old storytellers asked at the end of tales, just as they asked questions at the beginning. It was not always spoken aloud. Sometimes it was simply left in the air of the firelit room, in the silence after the last words, while the listeners sat with what they had heard and let it settle into them like rain into earth. The unspoken question at the end was always some form of, and what do we do with this? What do we do with the knowledge that the thunder god was betrayed? That the most powerful being in the celestial realm could be wounded by those he loved? That the great divine order of things, for all its beauty and necessity, was maintained through perpetual struggle and perpetual cost? What do we do with the knowledge that the betrayal was not evil, simply, that those who drifted toward Velus were following something real in themselves, something that the bright upper world could not accommodate, something that the underground had genuinely to offer? What do we do with a mythology that refuses to divide cleanly into good and evil, that insists on the necessity of the serpent as much as the thunder, on the winter as much as the spring? Let us sit with Perun for a moment at the end of our telling. Not the fierce, pursing, chariot-driving Perun. Not the enforcer of sacred law, the wielder of divine axes. But the Perun who withdrew to the sky after the battle at the roots. The one who sat with the still interior thunder while the world below waited for rain. What was he thinking, in those moments of divine quietness? The myths do not tell us. This is the gap where imagination, where the listener's own heart, is invited to fill in. This is one of the things that oral mythology always offered and that written, codified, canonical mythology tends to foreclose: the space for the listener to bring themselves to the story, to feel their own parallel losses and betrayals in the shape of the god's experience. Some of the people who listened to these stories in the firelit rooms of ancient Slavic houses had been betrayed by family. Of course they had. Every community of human beings contains this experience. The friend who shared secrets with your enemy. The sibling who chose alliance with the wrong side. The spouse who was led somewhere your love could not follow. Those people heard the story of Perun and recognized it. Not as metaphor. As their own life, given cosmic scale. Given the dignity of divine drama. Their pain made visible in the thunder. And the end of the story, not a triumphant end, not a clean resolution, but the ongoing negotiation, the seasonal cycling of loss and return, the perpetual battle that maintains the world, was something they could live with. Something that made sense of how life actually felt. You do not simply win the fight and move on. You fight again next year. And the year after. The cattle come back. The rains return. Spring arrives. And you do not forget the winter, but you are glad for the green. The scholars who study Slavic mythology, who have spent their careers sifting through the chronicles and the folk records and the comparative mythological materials, trying to reconstruct what was lost in those centuries of Christianization and subsequent historical upheaval, speak sometimes with a kind of mourning about the incompleteness of what remains. So much is gone. The Slavic people left no Iliad, no Edda, no Mahabharata. No one wrote down the great cycles when they were still alive, when the folkvi were still practicing, when the oak fires were still burning and the mythology was a living thing held in the bodies and mouths of its believers. What remains is fragments, mentioned in chronicles that described the old religion in order to condemn it, preserved in folk tales that had forgotten their divine context, reconstructed through the careful work of comparative mythology that matches Slavic motifs against their cognates in other Indo-European traditions. This incompleteness is itself significant. It is part of the story. The mythology of Perun is, among other things, a mythology about what survives destruction. About what roots hold when the tree above is cut. About what the underground preserves when the surface is swept clean. Delos, the god of the underworld, of roots and depth and what is hidden, kept the mythology as he kept everything. In the dark. In the fragments that fell through the surface world's cracks. In the folk memory that looked like superstition to the missionaries, like peasant habit to the scholars, like irrelevant local color to everyone who was not paying close enough attention. He kept it. And it is still there. In the spring iris. In the rumble of summer thunder. In the fairy tale about the hero who must go underground to recover what the deathless sorcerer stole. In the way the oak tree stands its ground in the storm and lets the lightning come, and splits, and survives. The story of Perun, the thunder god betrayed by his own family, is ultimately a story about what love costs and what love endures. It is about the god who was powerful enough to shake the mountains and gentle enough to be wounded by tenderness. It is about the world's need for both the high and the deep, the bright and the dark, the storm and the quiet root. It is about the seasonal revelation that loss is not the end. That the lost thing can be partially returned. That the rain goddess comes back. That spring comes. That the flowers called by her name push through the cold earth every year as though the cost of their appearing is irrelevant to them, as though beauty does not negotiate with grief but simply arrives, persistent and unbiddable, in its own time. Still present. Still powerful. Still wounded. Still here. The great world tree stands. Its roots go down into the dark. Its branches go up into the bright. The two realms still hold their tension, still maintain their necessary opposition. The human world in the middle, sustained between them, still dependent on the rain, still turning its face up to the summer storm with something that is equal parts fear and gratitude. And in the thunder, in that long low rumble that moves across the plains and through the mountain passes and over the rivers and the forests and the sleeping cities, there is a memory. Old enough to be older than memory. Old enough to be in the body before it is in the mind. The memory of a God who loved everything he had, and lost it, and kept fighting anyway. This is the oldest story. And it is told tonight, here, in the quiet space between waking and sleep, in the dark behind your closed eyes, in the place where the roots of your own life reach deeper than you usually look. The thunder god is not so far away. He never was. Let the story settle now. Let the images go slowly, the way storm clouds dissolve at the end of a summer afternoon. Not all at once, but gradually, the edges softening, the darkness lightening, the sky returning to its clear, deep, star-filled self. The world tree is still standing. You can feel its roots beneath you, going deep into the dark, and its branches above you, going high into the bright. You are exactly where you should be, in the middle. In the living world. Sustained between the depths and the heights. Perun has ridden out. He is moving somewhere across the sky's vast distances, doing the work that the sky always does, maintaining the order that makes rain possible, making the dark clouds give up their water so that the earth below can breathe. And Veles is in the roots, as he has always been. Keeping what the deep keeps. The wisdom that accumulates in stillness. The knowledge of how every living thing must eventually descend before it can rise again. Both are present. Both are necessary. Both are, in their ancient opposition, keeping the world alive. And you are here, in the human middle, in the warm dark of a night that is entirely ordinary and entirely miraculous, the way all nights are, the earth turning, the stars moving in their old paths, the roots below and the sky above, and you in the center of it all, breathing slowly, your body releasing the day's tensions one by one, returning to the original rest that the mythology says existed before the first storm. Before the egg opened. Before the world poured out. That deep, original quiet is still here. It is always here, beneath everything. Beneath the thunder and the betrayal and the seasonal grief and the spring return. The quiet that Veles knows in his deepest roots. The quiet that Perun knows in the still eye of the storm. It is available to you now. Let your breathing be slow. Let the story hold you gently, the way old stories hold the people who listen to them, not tightly, not with any demand, but with the warmth of something that has been told 10,000 times around 10,000 fires, that carries in it the accumulated comfort of all those listeners, all those nights, all those moments when a human being needed to hear that the world was old and large and holding them without being asked. You are held. The thunder is quiet tonight, The rain will come when it comes. Sleep now. Sleep now. If you're still awake, just breathe slowly and let the ancient stories drift with you. Subscribe to Mythology for sleep for a new legend every week. Sweet dreams.